Okay, Chuck, you can call the order at will. I'm ready, I
Thank you,
think.
Kathleen. So we'll call this meeting to order and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
The United States of America, and to the republic
for which
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all. Thank you.
Okay, I'm up. So please note this meeting is being recorded. Uh-oh, wait, something's in my way.
Megan's got an issue.
Who has an issue?
Megan Stolen says she doesn't have sound.
Hang on. Where's she at?
She needs to check her settings.
Everybody else can hear fine?
Yes, looks like it.
Trying to find her. There she is. Okay, Megan, it looks like it's on your end. Can you check your settings on your computer if you can hear us? Oh, you can't hear us. Huh. Yeah.
Dwayne sent a text or a chat. So
Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get reading this so we can try and stay on track. Please note this meeting is being recorded, video and audio. Additionally, all chat conversations will be recorded and preserved for public record. As we adjust to online meetings, we want to share the following logistical information. All attendees are muted and must be unmuted in order to be heard. For those participating via computer, the raise hand tool is an icon at the bottom of your screen, or can be found by clicking the participants box, or we have found the chat box. For those participating via phone, dial *9 and that will raise your hand. The meeting host will see a list of everyone who wants to speak and will unmute and call on those individuals one at a time. Attendees will remain muted until specific moments on the agenda when the public comment is accepted. Members of the public who wish to give public comment will be unmuted to speak one at a time. To indicate that you want to speak, use the Zoom raise hand tool when the meeting gets to the public comment agenda item. Prior to speaking, all public comment speakers are requested to please state your name and residence or affiliation for the record. Additionally, I'm going to do a verbal roll call, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself for just the next few minutes, so we can try and do that as quickly as possible. If I don't call your name when I'm done with the official roll call, can you please let me know that I've missed you or that you are a guest for the official record. Also, we want to point out for all voting, we're going to do it a little bit differently. We've had a little bit of trial and error over the past couple of meetings to learn that when you give your motion, make sure you're also giving your name. We have several screens of people, and trying to catch who's talking at one point in time when you're quick is very difficult. So make your motion, state your name, and then when it comes to final call for a vote, instead of calling for confirmation, we're going to call for opposition. There's fewer people opposing than there are people that are approving. So everybody got the kind of rules of the road going forward? All right, here we go. Annie Birch.
I'm here.
Chris Disco.
Here.
Kevin Cooper. David Cox. Leroy Cresswell. Bob Day. Chris Farrell. Frank Golan. Alexandria Salazar Serena. Oh, Bob, I see you. Okay. Dennis.
I'm here.
Dr. Ho.
that Jay Cho? She's not, don't see her yet.
Okay. Chuck's here, Kevin Johnson's here,
Present.
Lisa Krimsky,
Here.
and Andrea Ludu.
He's not here.
Okay. Dale McGinnis. Rich,
I'm here.
Valerie Paul,
Here.
Mark Perry. Beth Powell is absent. Wendy, did you make it back in? Mitch.
Mitch
Make
is
it back. Yep, there he is. I know I saw him earlier. Lisa, I see you. Megan's here. She couldn't talk. Chad? Chad Truxell. Lisa Walters? Or Linda Walters, I'm sorry.
Walters. Yep,
Sorry.
here. It's okay.
Sorry. Edie Witter? And Deborah Woodall. All right, so those that I'm missing. I see Dr. Trippery.
Right, hi.
Robert, Valerie, Annie, Lisa, Linda. Rob Barron's here. Jay Miller. Anybody else that should be on the member list that I missed?
Wendy is chatting that she is here.
Yep, I saw her. Zach Leibowitz. Hang on, one more page, y'all. Christopher, Megan, Kevin, Bob, Annie. Okay, I think we are good to go. Chuck,
Okay,
there we go.
okay, been there. Agenda revisions. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to alter regarding the agenda? Okay. We kind of just had introductions, so we'll probably carry on. So move on to the next one. Approval of the minutes from the last meeting, which was in February. Does anyone have anything they'd like altered in the minutes? If not, then would someone make a motion that we approve said minutes?
So moved.
Second.
State
guys-
your name. Hey, guys, remember to state your name when you're making a motion, so we make sure we call
Sorry,
you.
Mitchell Roffer, so moved. Accept the minutes as written.
Rich Paperno, second the motion.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any discussion about that? Anybody opposed? Raise your hand, wave your arms, shout.
Looks
Okay.
good.
Minutes approved. Public comment. I'm gonna ask for, does anyone from the public wish to comment? Raise your hand or somehow let Kayleen know.
I see no one.
We'll move on. Okay, the water quality reports, I'm up first. So again, just sort of briefly go over where things have been since the beginning of the year, basically. So these are data that come from the sondes that are out there, basically do continuous monitoring at the 5 places you see. So up in Mosquito Lagoon, at the southern end of Mosquito Lagoon, in Banana River Lagoon, in the Indian River side near Cocoa, down around O'Galley, and then down at Vero. So first off, salinities. If you look, you can see that the two ends, Mosquito Lagoon and Vero, have the higher salinities. Mosquito Lagoon tends to have, a lot of evaporation, not a lot of freshwater input. Vero has the various inlets, and then in the rest of the lagoon is hovering right around 20-ish, up a little bit. That looks like O'Galley there, where it's risen a bit. Next, Kayleen, thank you. Temperatures are surprisingly uniform throughout the lagoon over these last 5 months, 4 or 5 months. Rising up now, they're up in or just under 30, 28 in there, that range. So up in the upper 80s. Next. Chlorophyll levels from March on have been pretty low, pretty much throughout the lagoon. Some potentially sporadic sets of blooms, particularly further south, but generally speaking, all pretty low. It's been a pretty quiet start to the year. Wasn't too bad at the tail end of last year either. So next. Oh, she's coming. There we go. And all that kind of adds up to the fact that things like dissolved oxygen concentrations have been pretty good. Nowhere near the sort of 2 milligrams per liter where you might expect an issue. All up right around 8, between sort of 6 and 8 probably. Next, thank you. So the 2019 seagrass maps should be up on the district's website, hopefully within a couple of weeks. But the initial, they've gone through quality control and quality assurance. And right now it's looking like there's about 33,000 acres of seagrass this year, this past mapping year, 2019. So spring 2019 was when the photos were taken. And that's down 42% from the high that we had in 2007, down to 42% of that level. We're seeing things like caulerpa grow in different places, and hoping that that leads to some stabilization of the sediments and maybe gives seagrass a chance to come back if we keep having relatively clear water. So places like Banana River Lagoon, where nobody'd seen the bottom for quite a while, you can see that now. So happy to take questions.
This is Mitch. There have been some reports from the Orca that the Turnbill chlorophyll was very high and the oxygen was very low. I talked or communicated with Edie Witter, and they found out that those readings were erroneous. So if you've been following the Orca measurements, don't panic. It showed, anyhow, erroneous measurements, and I'm glad to see that you don't have those in your data and everything looks good.
Yeah, we didn't have anything that looked like that. I mean, we don't have continuous monitoring in Turnbull, but the sample in early April wasn't really showing the levels that they were seeing. So, but it wasn't one of those strange kind of right angle increases. So, it looked kind of real, but optical sensors, sometimes they're a battle.
No, it shows the challenges of doing real-time ocean monitoring in the public eye. So everyone should take this as a lesson. If you haven't been burned before, of showing something and all of a sudden you find out that it's not a disaster, it was just a bad reading.
And that's why my beard's gotten so gray.
And that's why I don't have any.
And I have no hair.
Next. Katie?
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katie Bowes. If you don't know me already, I'm an environmental resource specialist with Martin County, and I'm going to give a quick update on the South IRL conditions. Next slide, please. So we'll start with a little positivity. These are just some anecdotal accounts that I've seen on social media and also on Ms. Thurlow Lippish's blog about just some anecdotal occurrences of people seeing increased marine life. We've got a lot of fishermen reporting healthy oyster populations. The middle picture is an aerial view of some seagrass acreage that expanded near Sailfish Point, which is right at the mouth of the estuary. Also, there have been more sightings of sawfish further south towards Palm Beach County, and lots of baby queen conch are returning to the sandbar, also closer to Stewart. So those are just some positive things that hopefully, this low rain, no discharge period, and maybe there's a little perk of having less people on the water could make things be a little better right now. Next slide, please. So looking at general conditions over the last 4 weeks or so, the average rainfall in March was 0 inches, and we're pretty much trending towards that with April as well. Oh, it's May already. It was about the same for April. I totally forgot it's May already. So the graph on the right shows the freshwater discharges from Lake Okeechobee towards the end of April, and even all of the spring, there were none. There was actually water being pumped from the C-44 into the lake. Salinity the last few weeks has averaged the range is between 20 to 28 at Speedy Point, which is kind of by the Stewart City Center, and the mid-estuary going closer to Jensen Beach, about 31 to 36. Same with pH, in good range, about 7.8 to 8.1 range, going from city center of Stewart up to Jensen Beach. Next slide, please. We can go to the next one, sorry. So if you look at this graph on the right, that black line at the bottom is the water shortage management band in Lake Okeechobee. And we've been teetering right above that line, which has been really good for the estuary and the South IRL, but also really good for the lake ecology itself. The picture on the left are Vallisneria beds. That was taken on March 25th. And those are rebounding a lot, especially near the shorelines of the lake. They're hoping to see it be pushed further out in the center and closer to the east side where the Port Mayaca Dam is. But, it's still another, positive thing from the little rain that we've had, and the lake levels being pretty low. So there's also been lots of good fishing on the lake. I don't know if I would eat it out of there, but other people do. We can go to the next slide. So despite there being, better conditions, we are still seeing some blue-green algae, not in the estuary. It's only been in the Port Mayaca area. So if you look at this satellite image of Lake Okeechobee, the bar at the bottom shows the bloom potential on the lake, and you can look at these images every day on NOAA's website. So I pulled this from April 28th, and that was in the moderate to high range for bloom potential. And as of now, the Department of Health has put up some signs around the Port Mayaca area, warning people to be aware of toxins and algae presence. Next slide, please. So if you look, this aerial picture on the left, this was also taken from Ms. Thurlow-Lippish's blog. This was on April 4th, that shows a blue-green algae bloom in the C-44 canal. And then the picture on the right is within the lake, and that's the Port Mayaca Lock and Dam that you see in that picture, and that's just some algae washed up on the shore, and that was April 14th. So I get alerts every time there's any kind of bloom reported in Martin County, and I got them about 3 times in April, and they were all in the Port Mayaca area. But if we look on the next slide, this shows, this is the FDEP blue-green algae sampling dashboard. So in the last 30 days, there have been 8 sampling events for blue-green algae, and 5 out of 8 of those showed presence of microcystis. And the one that's in the C-44 canal near Indiantown was one of the ones that did not show presence. So it was taken some days after that aerial image was taken. So it's just something we're keeping an eye out on, hoping that water can keep being back pumped into the lake and that we don't have to deal with too many discharges as we approach the rainy season. Next slide. I think it's just questions. Yeah, that went a lot better than this morning. If anyone has any questions, you can let me know.
Katie, this is Mitch. Do you have any measurements or sense of what's going on in Fellsmere, the Stick Marsh? I have no measurements or anything. I was just wondering if you know about the quality there.
I do not, and I don't know of any water quality stations that are out there. There could be something on the DB Hydro website, but no, I apologize. I do not have any data for that area.
No worries. Just wondering.
Any other questions?
I see none.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's certainly my pleasure to introduce Professor Ed Buskey. Comes to us from Texas and was involved in the examination of the brown tide that they had there, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. So over to you, Ed.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. So anyway, here's the title of my presentation. So of course, and I should begin by saying I'm not a native Texan, but as they say here, everything is bigger in Texas. So this is a story of the 8-year brown tide bloom that we had in both Baffin Bay and Laguna Madre in Texas. So this was the first known and first documented bloom of what we used to call the Texas brown tide, which is Orio umbra lagunensis. Next slide, please. So anyway, here's just sort of general outline of what I want to talk about. So I guess one of the things I've always thought was kind of unique about this was sort of scientific serendipity. We had an ecosystem study of the Upper Laguna Madre underway right when the bloom began. So we were able to document the initiation of it, sort of understand the factors that maintain the long bloom, and then we followed it all the way through until its demise about 8 years later. So I think it's one of the more complete studies of brown tide, especially the fact that we were able to study the initiation of it, and that was really just by luck. So in terms of the bloom initiation, we'll talk about the fact that there was a extended drought, then we had a very severe freeze, led to a fish kill that put a big pulse of nutrients into the system, and then we also found that a lot of the grazers had also been knocked back by the combination of hypersalinity and low temperatures. So again, all the right conditions at one time in order to allow this thing to really bloom to quite extensive capabilities. And of course, it was a new species, so it took a while. We were just calling it the Texas brown tide for about 5 years before somebody finally gave a complete description of the species. So we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics that lead to its persistence in the system, some of the environmental impacts, and then finally talk about what made it go away. Next slide, please. So I think as in Florida, we're very interested in sort of freshwater inflow studies in Texas. And so a number of us here at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute have been doing freshwater inflow studies. I arrived in 1986 and through 1989 when this Laguna Madre study began. So these were all funded by the Texas Water Development Board. So we've done Lavaca Bay, San Antonio Bay, Corpus Christi Bay. We've been sort of moving our way from the north to the south along the Texas coast. And anyway, so this led to some studies of the Laguna Madre. These were funded instead by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Next slide, please. So anyway, so we wrote a proposal. One of the things we were interested in is, we've been trying to look at the relationship between freshwater inflows and productivity of these different bay systems in Texas. one of the things that we thought didn't go along with the sort of standard thinking was, turns out that the highest finfish production on the Texas coast occurred in Baffin Bay and the upper Laguna Madre, which doesn't have any permanent rivers going into it, doesn't get a lot of freshwater inflow. So how does a hot hypersaline lagoon maintain such a large fishery? So that was the premise of our study. And so we use similar approach to we'd use in our other freshwater inflow studies. We go down on our research vessel, the Longhorn, we'd use it as a floating hotel and floating laboratory. We go out in small boats and make samples for 1 week out of the month. And we did this for 2 years. So we had 4 process stations where we do more intense things like primary production measurements and some other doing dilution experiments for measuring grazing and things like that. And then we had 40 water quality stations. So these are not data sondes, these are just locations where we go out and take water samples to chlorophyll, nutrients, and so on. Next slide, please. So anyway, this study was going along well until Mother Nature sort of threw us a curveball. We had a severe freeze in late December that you can see in this upper slide, that's air temperature, and we were below freezing for over 2 days, which is very rare in our part of South Texas. So, and it was very cold. And so even in the hypersaline Laguna Madre, so Laguna Madre is normally around 40 to 45 parts per thousand salinity. Baffin Bay is up to 50 or 60 parts per thousand salinity. We had ice even forming along the shoreline during that period. So very unusual in especially such a salty area. And there was an extensive fish kill as well as a big dieback of benthic organisms and so on. So basically it's a very shallow system, typically less than a meter. Baffin Bay is deeper, but anyway, it caused a really massive fish kill. Next slide. So within a short time of that, our normally fairly clear Laguna Madre, so it's an area where fishermen like to go and sight cast for red drum, suddenly became very densely populated with this obvious algal bloom. So we had cell densities of some small phytoplankton species up to 5 million cells per milliliter, obviously very discolored water, Secchi depths of only a few tens of centimeters. And it was a small cell, again, about 4 or 5 microns in diameter, no distinct morphological characteristics, so we really didn't know what it was. Next slide. So in the upper picture is just, this is actually a phytoplankton toe sample with a 20 micron net, but so typically before the brown tide, we'd have a nice mixture of diatoms and a few dinoflagellates, and then this is just a whole water sample below that with obviously the brown tide cells. And one of the characteristics of it as well is that it has all this sort of mucousy material around it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. So one of the consequences of this fish and invertebrate kill was we had a spike in ammonium concentrations as all this biomass decomposed. So we had a big spike in ammonium. And then we also had, again, this rapid increase in brown tide cells, particularly initially in Baffin Bay, where the salinity is the highest. So again, 50 to 60 parts per thousand salinity. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I was interested in addition to the phytoplankton itself, is looking at the grazers. So again, a little hard to see. This is from an old publication, but if you look at this top panel here, thinking about the protozoan grazers, you can see this dashed line that's over towards the left that's kind of spiky. That's showing the population of microzoa plankton. So that actually declined before the freeze due to the hypersalinity. So you can see that dotted line going across is the salinity. And so, for example, in Alazan Bay, one of the side bays of Baffin Bay, it got up to around 70 parts per thousand salinity. And then you can see the brown tide, the line that appears almost solid there, increase after that. So this was what it initially started in this Baffin Bay area. Next slide, please. So again, we didn't really know what it was. So I had been, prior to this, I just finished up my PhD and then done a postdoc at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. And in 1985, Dean Stockwell and I, who Dean was also at the Marine Sciences at the time, we were at that graduate school up there, and we'd experienced the brown tide up there, the Oreococcus anaphageferens brown tide. So we saw some similarities. It was bigger. There were some other differences, but we really didn't know what it was. But we tried to get some people interested in figuring out what it was. And so again, for the first 5 years, we didn't really know what it was, but we were just calling it a brown tide because it seemed similar to the Oreococcus blooms. So, and as that famous philosopher Yogi Berra said, it was like deja vu all over again. Next slide, please. So in order to be able to count it reliably, obviously it's a small, morphologically indistinct cell. We decided to, and we didn't know whether it had always been in the Laguna Madre, was it widely distributed, was something that just, came down on a meteorite or something and invaded the Laguna Madre. We wanted to learn more about it. So in order to do that, Tracy Villarreal at our lab developed an immunofluorescent probe so that we could positively identify that. So basically, we took preserved brown tide cells and injected them into rabbits and made a antibody so we could identify it, also known as a furry with a syringe on top. Next slide, please. So once we had that tool, we found that the brown tide had always been in the Laguna Madre, or certainly it had been since the beginning of our study. So typically, prior to the big bloom, it was in the hundreds to thousands of cells per milliliter. Because of its indistinct appearance, it was just part of the cryptic flora, I think, in terms of the phytoplankton. We probably saw little dots there, but we didn't think too much of it, very small. Then we also did some sampling around the Gulf and down south in Mexico and even as far south as Belize. We were carrying out some other studies, and we found it was generally found in the western, northwestern Gulf of Mexico and as far south as Laguna Madre to Tamaulipas. We did also check, it was not in Terrebonne Bay, but we did find it in Florida Bay, but not down in Belize. So fairly widely distributed, but not everywhere. Next slide, please. So anyway, finally, until 1997, quite a bit later, it was finally officially described. So again, a new species, Oreoumbra lagunensis. I'm not sure who picked the name, but anyway, basically means the brown shade on the lagoon. Next slide. So, why did it persist so long in the Laguna Madre? That was some of the things we wanted to try to understand. So we did we brought it into culture, and then we were able to do growth experiments in a wide range of salinities and temperatures. Here you can see in this upper panel. And basically, it can grow in salinities as high as 90 parts per thousand, or 90 practical salinity units. So it's very tolerant of high salinities. That makes it a good thing to bloom in the Laguna Madre. Also, Curtis Suttle and Dio did a study looking at its nitrogen sources, how it grew on that. And basically, it grows well on ammonium or nitrite, but as a nitrogen source, but it can't grow on nitrate. So it doesn't seem to use nitrate at all. So again, it's something that would grow well in an area that didn't necessarily have a lot of freshwater inflows bringing in a lot of nitrate. Next slide. So the other thing I think that really contributed to it as well is that the Laguna Madre is a very isolated system. So you can see in this map here, shows the Laguna Madre is the strip going from north to south, and then off to the left of that, you can see Baffin Bay with its three sort of small arms. So it's a drowned river valley from the Pleistocene period. But you can see that to the south, there's this area called the Land Cut, where basically a former hurricane had sort of closed up the connection between the upper Laguna Madre and the lower Laguna Madre. But when they built the Intracoastal Canal, it was reconnected, but that's the only exchange point between them is the Intercoastal Canal. To the north, you can kind of see a little thin strip going across near the opening to Corpus Christi Bay. And that's a causeway. So, this was built back in the 50s or 60s. And basically they just dumped sand there all the way across. And then when they built the intercoastal waterway, they made a cut through for that. So again, very limited circulation. So it's a hot area, very little rainfall. There's no permanent streams going into Baffin Bay. So just, temporary streams whenever it rains. And so a lot of evaporation. So again, the high salinities and very little net export of water from the system. So it makes a really good system for maintaining this sort of a long bloom. Next slide. Anyway, so I did a lot of studies trying to understand why none of the protozoa wanted to eat it. And just to make a long story short, basically they would eat it well at low concentrations, but at higher concentrations, it always seemed to suppress their grazing, either whether it was in mixtures of other things or just being offered alone. So there was something about this phytoplankton species that the protozoa didn't like, or many of them didn't like, especially when it was at high concentrations. Next slide. So we did find one thing that would like to eat it. It's a very common heterotrophic dinoflagellate, Oxyrus marina. It could grow well on it even at high concentrations. The only problem was that Oxyrus, unlike a lot of the other protozoa we were looking at, does not do well at high salinities. So, for example, its growth rate is good at low salinities, but decline with increases in salinity. So it doesn't really do so well in hypersaline conditions. So in fact, whenever eventually the salinities did start to drop in Lagoon Madre, this was actually one of the major grazers on the organism. Next slide. So one of the other things I already talked a little about is, the cell is characterized by this thick layer of TEP, transparent extracellular polysaccharides. So for example, in the upper figure here, one of my postdocs, Hongbin Yu, and I did a study where we tried to remove some of this TEP by centrifuging the cells. We could get some of it removed, and basically whatever the various protozoa that we tried would feed on it much more readily when that TEP was removed. And in fact, we did some other studies looking at copepods, and we found that copepods would ingest it, but basically the TEP seemed to protect it from being digested. And basically the fecal pellets were just packed with brown tide cells. You could break them open and you could start new cultures, as the cells were still completely viable inside the fecal pellets. Next slide. So anyway, again, not nutritious to copepods. This is looking at egg production in the top slide there, and basically it's only a little bit higher than starved copepods, whereas other things seem to do well. But when we gave it, for example, something that supported high egg production like Thalassia syra, if we added brown tide to that, it didn't seem to depress the egg production. Turned out to be not so good for the new nauplii of copepods. These are Carchatonza, the most common copepod in our system. And basically, when you gave them brown tide, they died faster than if they were just starved. So again, something that really not appealing to them about that. Next slide. And again, this is just sort of some other studies that we did where we started to get this sense that there was some sort of a threshold concentration that seemed to suppress grazers in the system. So in this upper panel, you can see when we took natural seawater and then filtered all the organisms out and then added brown tide inoculum to it, they all grew well with different sizes of inoculum. So, up to 500,000 cells per mil at the highest level. When we added them to whole seawater containing the protozoa and grazers, the cells wouldn't grow well at low concentrations. In other words, the grazers were eating them. But when we went to the higher concentrations, they grew just as well as they did in the filtered seawater. So again, basically, we found that there was a threshold of somewhere between 100,000 cells per mil and maybe 500,000 cells per mil that seemed to suppress grazing activities. Next slide. So also, of course, there were a lot of impacts on the ecosystem. Probably the one that was the most obvious to the general public was the decrease in seagrasses. So basically the brown tide eventually spread throughout the entire Laguna Madre, upper and lower, and really did cause a dieback in seagrasses. Next slide. So this is some data from Ken Dunton. So in the upper one, it's looking at the root and rhizome biomass, and this is station A within the upper Laguna Madre. You can see how it's decreasing over time compared to East Flats, which was in Corpus Christi Bay, where it seemed to be maintaining itself over that same period. Next slide, please. So also seemed to have an impact on benthic invertebrates. The upper graph showing biomass, the lower graph showing abundance. You can see that the abundance and biomass of macrofauna, benthic macrofauna within the Laguna Madre and Baffin Bay decreased quite a bit during the period of the initial brown tide. This is some data by Paul Montagna. Next slide, please. However, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Fisheries data show that there was almost no impact on adult fisheries. So though in fact the black drum, which is what the big fishery in Laguna Madre and Baffin Bay is, big commercial fishery, they actually increased during this period. And that may have been partly due to sort of a decrease in fishing pressure as well. The commercial fishermen kept going pretty much, but a lot of the individual fishermen, fishing pressure sort of slacked off. Next slide. But one thing we didn't find was that this is some data from Scott Holt at our place, and larval fish abundance dropped quite dramatically with higher brown tide concentrations. So again, the brown tide cells seem to suppress, I don't know if they either just moved away or if they were negatively affected in terms of their populations. But wherever we saw higher concentrations of brown tide, we saw very few larval fish, either spotted sea trout or black drum are these two examples. Next slide. And so Joan Holt did some experiments in the laboratory and also found that basically red drum larval survival decreased in the presence of brown tide. Next slide. So, by year 6 or 7, we started to get a lot of concern. So particularly, fishing guides in the upper Laguna Madre were losing money because nobody wanted to go out and fish in the Laguna Madre. Again, it was a clear lagoon where you would typically go out and sight fish for red drum and other species. So people started getting anxious to try to figure out what we can do to make this go away. There was all sorts of discussion of, looking for a virus that would kill it, or chemical agents, flocculants. We actually did some things to look at biological control. I tried growing oxyrus up in some of these tanks and seeing it if it would suppress it, and it did initially, but then the copepods ate all the oxyrus, so that didn't work in any sort of realistic conditions. So it was other sort of interest in other control strategies, nutrient reductions, and so on. And improved circulation was one thing that people talked about, maybe making some breaches in the barrier island to improve the circulation into that system. Next slide. So finally, the bloom did go away though. So in 1997, so I always joke that basically the federal funding ends the bloom. So basically, I've been trying for years to get funding from the National Science Foundation to study it. I've only been getting local funds. And so when we finally did get funds, it ended within a few months. So basically, but of course it wasn't that, it was actually the 1997 El Nino. So if you look at this figure, it shows salinity and rainfall, the bars at the bottom. And so basically around 1997, we started getting some more rainfall than usual. And in fact, we got one really extreme event that essentially flushed out the system. So anyway, I always joke about that if you ever want to get rid of a harmful algal bloom, just have to get me some federal funding to study it, and then it'll go away. I got 3 years of funding once to study the red tides here in Texas, and we didn't get a red tide the whole time I had the funding. So you guys need to get rid of those Florida red tides on the West Coast. Just fund me for some red tide studies there. Next slide. Okay, so, and at the end, basically, so don't it make my brown tides blue? Basically, when the salinity dropped rapidly, the brown tide was replaced with a blue-green algal bloom. right? So then the salinity rose again a little bit after that. The brown tide returned again, only to decline again. So basically, again, that system has such poor circulation that, you know, once it was flushed out of there, now we do still get occasional brown tides in there, typically in the spring, but eventually they go away. So there was something about, you know, just having it there at that really high concentration for so long that seemed to suppress the grazers and the other factors that would eventually cause the demise of a bloom like that. Next slide. This is just another study. This is something that Pat Parker and his group did. They took some really deep cores in Baffin Bay and did some stable isotope analysis. And basically the long-term record shows that there's this sort of natural variation in this system where it'll spend, you know, a couple of decades being dominated by phytoplankton, and then a couple of decades being dominated by seagrass carbon, which have different stable isotope signatures. And so basically, we also would see layers of sand indicating the passage of hurricanes. So what we think goes on there is when there's better circulation within the system, it tends to support the seagrasses a little bit better. When there's a period of low circulation for a long time, we do tend to get more of these algal blooms. So again, that the long-term record seems to support that as well. Next slide. So as to wrap it all up, in terms of the take-home messages, I think, you know, we think that grazer disruption, both by the zooplankton, which is with the groups that I was studying, but also with the benthos, a lot of the filter-feeding mollusks and worms in the bottom, that was really important to the bloom initiation. So basically that freeze and the hypersalinity coming all at the same time knocked those populations back. And once that cell density threshold was exceeded, the bloom seemed to suppress the grazers, and that allowed it to persist for quite a long time, again, in a semi-enclosed system with very limited exchange. So there was very limited evidence that it's directly toxic to grazers or to anything else. So, you know, there was some indication that Oreococcus was, you know, toxic to mollusks and some other things. We aren't finding too much evidence of direct toxicity, but again, it seems like this TEP maybe interferes with grazing by some organisms. So I think that's it. Next slide. Maybe just thanks to our funders. Next slide, and our collaborators. So these are all folks that helped with all the studies that I was talking about. And last slide is, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ed. You have questions?
You had said earlier that you were going to talk a little bit about it going to the end and what the conditions were that caused it to become a small part, if not gone, from the system. Doesn't it provide cysts that sit down in the mud ready to come up when the conditions are right?
Well, so I don't know that anybody has anybody identified a cyst for it yet? I'm not aware that there is one. I mean, the cells are very resistant, so they certainly may persist. And again, we always found it in background concentrations. So I think it's something that's always there, at least in our system, you know, in hundreds to thousands of cells per milliliter, but it's only certain conditions that bring it up. And so again, the conditions that I think led to the demise of it was that very rainy period. So around 1997, 98, we got a lot of rainfall with the El Nino year, and that basically lowered the salinity in the Laguna Madre and Baffin Bay below hypersalinity. So that released it so that the grazers like Oxyrus could flourish and then basically graze the system down. But then it was replaced by a blue-green algal bloom. So also all that fresh water coming into the system added a lot of nitrate. So the area adjacent to this is the King Ranch, which folks in Texas like to point out is bigger than the state of Rhode Island, where I did my doctoral degree. But they grow a lot of cotton and other things, a highly intensive agriculture, as well as cattle ranching there. So when we got all that rain, it pushed a lot of nitrate into the system, and so that may have helped initiate the blue-green algal bloom.
Dr. Treffry?
Thanks, Ed. That's really interesting. do you have a sense of what nutrients we're doing over the whole cycle, especially phosphate and ammonium?
So phosphate, it's interesting. So the Laguna Madre is actually a phosphorus limited system. So there's a lot of nitrogen in there, mostly ammonium. So there, we have extensive mats of blue-green algae that fix nitrogen. And then when that breaks down, it seems to be released primarily as ammonium. When you look in the sediment cores, it's just incredibly high levels of ammonium in those in that pore water. So there seems to be no lack of nitrogen to drive the system, but so it actually has driven it to phosphorus limitation. So something that would probably be less likely in your area, because I think there's a lot of phosphorus in the sediments in
Well,
Florida.
interestingly enough, during the last brown tide in 2018, as it faded out, we went from about 3 micromolar phosphate down to about 0.1 or 0.2. And we had seen that once before in an earlier one, and that it really did seem to be challenged when phosphate went very low. Even though it has a lower phosphate requirement, it just seemed like that was certainly part of the waning moments of it.
Interesting. Yeah, so phosphorus is very low in the Laguna Madre in general, and so again, we with Hongbin Liu, one of my postdocs, he did some chemostat studies that showed that it seemed to have a very low phosphorus requirement compared to a lot of other phytoplankton.
Do you have a sense of what concentrations run there?
Oh boy, not off the top of my head. I'd be afraid to guess. I haven't thought about that data in 20 years.
Yeah, because for it to go away, it was really low. I mean, 0.1, 0.2 micromolar.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Anyone else, Kayleen?
I don't see anyone else.
All right. Thanks again, Ed. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Ed.
Thank you, Ed.
So now we're going to move to some updates on the various plans. Dennis?
Okay. And I think we learned a lot from Medstock. I think there's a lot to be learned from these two systems being compared, actually.
Yeah,
I
think one of the things we'll try to do is make sure that when we get our stuff pulled together, we bounce it off all those guys.
Yep. Okay, are we all set there to advance the slides? Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So most of you are very familiar with the plan. I'm not going to reiterate very much. If you don't remember the plan from previous meetings, there's the goal and some of the key points. But again, looking around the room, it seems like all of you heard one of the previous two talks. Sorry, you want to advance? I tried to do that.
I saw the movement.
yeah, I tried to advance. It didn't work too well. If you need a refresher on the steering committee, because there are several people in the meeting today that are on the steering committee, for example, a significant number of them actually, and you can bounce ideas off them as well as you can to me. It's a diverse group. We have a lot of the agencies listed, of course. We have universities. We have some other institutions, and we also have somebody from the USGS. Next slide. So when I ended my presentation in February, what my pattern will be for all these reports is this is what we're going to be doing in the next quarter, and that's what I'll report on today. Next slide. And you can hit again. So we have had 2 steering committee meetings. Our goal is to have 1 each month. So we had our initial one in early March. We had a little bit of a delay because of COVID, and I'm going to count the May 1st meeting as really an April meeting. And that, of course, was just Friday. So everything I'm telling you is as current as it can be. If you can hit it again. What we've mostly have worked on is listed here. You'll see there's a lot of relationship to the to-do list. And I will go through each of those bullets one by one. Next slide.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? Dr. Trifree, did you want to speak? Nope, that was from a few minutes ago. I apologize.
Okay.
Thanks.
And you can hit one more time. So one of the things we discussed a lot in March and also to some extent on Friday was vital signs and clarification of scope. And we did confirm with Dwayne that we are in fact going to address all 32 vital signs. There'll be more emphasis on the first 3 categories: water quality, habitat quality, living resources. But we also will address categories 4 and 5, which is community and one voice. So how we do this may be a little bit different for the different categories, but they all be included. And we actually have a separate working group among us who will address categories 4 and 5. Next slide. And again. So I'm not going to go through the table of contents in detail, but you may recall from our last meetings that Dwayne had drafted up a very high level, if you will, 1-page table of contents for each of these projects that you're hearing about. We further revised that, so now it's 2 pages with some more detail thrown in. This really is a living document, and will continue to evolve. But we do find it a very helpful procedure to always kind of go back and, as we talk about things, make some edits here. And as we get further along, we will start to hit different sections, and we can start writing the report earlier rather than later. So a lot of the things in the first part of the report that page is actually showing is introductory material, background material, the concept of monitoring, tying it into the CCMP. The bulk of the report will be on the various existing sampling and monitoring programs that we have in Lagoon, how they address vital signs, how they might all be interactive. And then the last few sections are things like new technologies, gaps, and so on. So it'll be pretty comprehensive report. Next slide. So we reviewed the draft criteria at both of our meetings. Again, a lot of dialogue about this. You can hit the next bullet, I think. And we talked again on Friday and kind of reaffirmed what we want to do. There's 4 key aspects of the criteria. The first one is it should link directly to an inner lagoon management, specifically the CCMP, and even more specifically the vital signs. It needs to be an active program. This is really a monitoring program that takes us into the future. So there may be excellent sources of information that have been collected in the past, but they're no longer active programs, and so it probably will not have a place in the monitoring plan as we conceive it now. Next slide. Data quality. I think it's obvious to almost everybody that's in the room, probably, if not everybody, that really all these programs will need a solid, established QA/QC program. If it's an EPA project, it needs to have a QA/PP. If a monitoring program does not have one of these, and it seems like they could and they should be part of the program, then I think we could work with them to encourage them to establish such a QA/QC document. Data accessibility. Many of you remember the workshop that we had on data several years ago here at Harbor Branch, and we talked about the need to increase the ability to have data available right away, as much as possible, freely available to researchers, managers, and the public. So one of the things we learned from that last effort, though, is that means different things to different people. And that's something that, again, we need to clarify for each of the programs and for the managing plan overall, but it's a high priority. Next slide. So you can throw the next bullets up too, I think. So we also have worked on how are we going to get the monitoring activities, how are we going to compile them, how are we going to try to work them in to a report. So we have started to review and add to a very early draft of the vital sign tables, and then listing the various potential sources of data that we think would be, at least to us, fairly obviously should be included in this effort. We will continue to add to that. We got several emails after the Friday meeting, for example, for other thoughts. and we will continue to solicit that, including everybody that's here. So the next thing is we worked on a draft of the survey questionnaire that will go out fairly soon to people or organizations that we've identified as data collectors. So the obvious things, of course, like, you know, what's the organization, who's the key contact person, the description of the monitoring program. We'd like to get some idea of the type of data collected, how often it's collected, how it addresses vital signs, the location in a general way at this point, and then what kind of QA/QC program do they have, and how accessible are the data. Next slide. Next slide. I mean, another. There you go. So our workshop plans. Well, you know, we thought we were going to do it live in the big auditorium here, right? Well, that's probably not going to happen. We said it was going to be done probably in June, because we thought that made the most sense. That would give us lots of time to work over the summer, which for most of us is a pretty busy time of year normally. And we could then have the report available and post it at the end of September as planned. We think with COVID, one of the good things about suddenly having, you know, 7 or 8 major things that I was supposed to do between now and then canceled for me is that I have more time later into this year as a result. So I have a lot more time than I normally will have in the summer. So we're likely to have a meeting like this, you know, a Zoom meeting. There's lots of ways that I think that kind of meeting can be made really flexible to make this work. And I think that gives us a little more time, because we did lose a little bit of time because people were impacted, of course, by the pandemic. And I think this will allow us to come up with a better draft for the workshop meeting. And in fact, we would need less actual number of days to turn it around to submit it by September 30th as planned. I think that's the last slide. Oh, sorry, no, it's not. It's the last slide in progress. What are we going to do this quarter? Go back, sorry. We are going to continue monthly steering committee meetings. We're going to do that every month. So since I said May 1st was really April for me, we're probably going to meet between the 27th and 29th. That's the short week at the end of the month, but that'll keep us, you know, going once a month. We're going to continue to expand and refine those vital signs data. We're going to add additional monitoring programs. We're going to put the points of contact there, make it readily useful to a lot of people. We're going to finalize and then distribute that survey questionnaire that I mentioned earlier. Separately, we're going to reach out to the two water management districts, because, as you know, they have enormous amounts of monitoring going on. And so I think a simple questionnaire would be a lot more onerous for them, and we can probably make this a little bit easier, because we know how important they are to the overall efforts. And then we will assemble and review all inputs. We'll schedule and plan the IRL monitoring workshop. And although everyone keeps talking about an August meeting for next NEP meeting, I believe you've actually scheduled it for the last week in July. And this will then be in August. And that's the last slide.
Any questions for Dennis? Guess not.
Seeing none.
Sweet.
Job, Dennis.
Good, I got work to do.
Okay, next up is Rob Barron.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to be giving you guys an update on the habitat restoration plan. You can go next slide, please. So just as a reminder, the goal of the Lagoon-wide habitat restoration plan is to assess how potential habitat restoration projects are spatially identified and integrated into the overall support for IRL biodiversity and resilience. And another goal is to identify proposed restoration sites and projects to improve water quality and biodiversity. And the plan will also serve as a comprehensive and integrated science-based habitat restoration plan to assist the IRL NEP partners as they implement restoration projects throughout the lagoon. And the plan will address specific habitat restoration needs, and it will provide general guidance to protect and restore IRL biodiversity. And lastly, the plan will be aligned with the CCMP and the Vital Signs Wheel. Next slide, please. So we were tasked with our scope of work here. It shows initially and continuing with stakeholder meetings to get input, developing our plan scope or our table of contents, and drafting the plan, the habitat restoration plan, soliciting, incorporating comments, and then coming up with a final plan. Next slide, please. So thanks for those of you who provided feedback on our table of contents and who provided some literature and references. They've been very helpful. Our table of contents has gone through a few iterations, but we feel it's at a point now, and probably about a month or so ago, where it was at a point where we were able to start researching and reviewing the literature and actually began drafting our first draft of the plan. Next slide, please. So the habitat restoration plan will incorporate habitat restoration priorities consistent with the CCNP, which I already mentioned. We'll discuss the criteria for habitat restoration and site selection. We'll include best restoration practices. And we'll discuss some permitting constraints with various restoration projects, some cost estimates, logistics, and discuss political opportunity. Next slide, please. So while keeping the CCNP restoration actions in mind, and after receiving feedback and reviewing our scope, we came to the conclusion that the plan was going to include these following habitats here shown on the screen now: water column, submerged bottom, seagrasses, filter feeders, mangroves, wetlands and salt marshes, managed mosquito impoundments, living shorelines, spoil islands, artificial reefs or artificial habitats, and communities at inlets. We'll see how it goes throughout the year. Our contract is through the end of September of this year. We're hoping that we'll be able to address most of these, and we're in pretty good position. A few of these may be, one example is the spoil islands. This is one that may not be filled in yet. We're kind of depending on DEP to provide some guidance for spoil islands. Next slide, please. And to maintain continuity within the document, each of those habitats that I just read will include the following subsections: background, status, restoration guidance and priorities, success criteria, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes. Next slide, please. So we're currently, as I mentioned, working on the draft document. We internally in Tetra Tech we're at a pretty good place where we've, like I said, begun populating the first draft, and we're hoping to share this with Dwayne to get some input directly from him either this week or next. And then after that, we'll be submitting our first official, our draft one, which will be due at the end of this month. Then our next task is to incorporate management conference partner feedback to the draft plan and to submit the second draft, which is due July 31st, 2020. And then the final step will be to refine the second draft into a final, which is then due September 30th, 2020. Next slide, please. So in the meantime, here's my contact information. You can reach out to me or Dwayne directly if you have any feedback or additional resources on any of those habitats that I mentioned. Even though we're working on it now, any thoughts or literature that you have that you'd be willing to share would be appreciated, and we would certainly incorporate anything like that you guys can contribute. So thank you very much.
Questions for Rob?
I see none.
Okay.
Hi, this is Ann. I don't
Oh,
know how to raise my hand, sorry.
that's okay. Go ahead, Ann.
Hey, Rob, wondering, you whipped through the table of contents, so I wasn't able to look at it. Is there any place in the table of contents where you look at a systems approach, rather than each habitat separately, which you do need to do, but how do they work together as well as a system?
Yeah, the slide there I just showed was actually, it's not the official table of contents. It was just to have a nice picture in the background.
Okay.
So that was an early version, but each habitat will be addressed individually, but I think Dwayne may be able to comment further. We are trying to consider the lagoon as a whole, as a kind of a thread through all of these habitats, a common thread, and how biodiversity just in general is going to be affected by various habitat restoration projects. So I think the hope is to yes, in fact, incorporate that, and not just to have static kind of habitat sections that don't talk to each other.
Okay.
Hey, Chuck, this is Dwayne. And we're going to be reaching out at some point in this draft document. That ecosystem-wide integration is going to be super important that we address it, but it also may be one of the biggest challenges that we have, you know, because of the nature of this system. And it may very well be we're going to have to look at, you know, Mosquito Lagoon and you know, the northern Indian River Lagoon versus southern. It may be that we're going to have to think about this in geographic segments. And so we'll be looking, and I'm going to mention this when we're done with these reports, but we're going to be looking to all of you, your expertise and your experience to help us in that integration, you know, of these different habitats. It's the biggest challenge I've given Tetra Tech is, you know, when you're done looking at habitat by habitat, we need to bring this into some context of what we want the system to think it's going to look like after restoration. So it's quite a challenge, but very good question.
Great, thank you.
Christopher? Hang on, get you unmuted. There you go.
Thank you. So I have a question too about as we integrate this system-wide, is there any effort to develop priorities or measures of priorities or resource allocation? How is that aspect of it going to be entered into this project?
Well, that's definitely something that we're tasked with. I don't have an answer directly for that yet, but we are looking into that, and each of our sections does have that question that Dwayne posed to us with that very issue with prioritizing different habitats and different projects and how it's going to all come together.
And I can add to that. So this is where the monitoring plan, the habitat restoration plan, the CCMP already adopted, and then what you're going to hear about in a minute, the science, the state of the lagoon plan, kind of all come together. And so at the end of these separate reporting activities, you know, we're going to have kind of the bits and pieces moving into, in our world, in the NEP, 5th year when you do an update of the CCMP, you know, we should have a lot deeper dive into the science, the habitats, the monitoring, the resource allocation. I'll talk about that right at the end, but really it's all about money. And that is going to be a challenge from top to bottom, trying to decide, you know, what moves first when in fact there is not sufficient money across the board to be doing the level of work that we need to do. So I may, if we have time, I'll address that at the end of the meeting. And if not this meeting, you're going to get a deep dive into financial allocations in about a month. We'll be sending a draft document, maybe 2 months, for all of you to take a look at it, kind of what the financial implications of a $4 to $6 billion restoration might take.
Anyone else?
I see no one.
Okay. So we're going to move on to 2 back-to-back efforts by Claudia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claudia Listopad, Applied Ecology, and I'm going to describe where we are at in 2 projects that we are currently working on. The first one is going to be our lagoon-wide asset mapping. Next. And here's just reiterating the goal of this project is really to integrate the data in one place, one repository. In this case, we're going to use all, of course, in the spatial setting. Some of the priorities here were selected along with the River Lagoon Estuary staff. This quarter, the focus was on building wetland maps, both looking historic and current coverages of different types, and also start focusing on vacant lands within the River Lagoon watershed. Next. And so this is what our task 4 includes. Includes the key habitat mapping of wetland habitat and focus on conservation lands. So as part of our conservation land effort, we wanted to not only look at the official conservation lands, we are currently mapping that, but we also wanted to look at what vacant land and ensure and look at private versus public and as a potential conservation area of conservation or where projects could be put in the future. But our first emphasis was on wetlands, and we just put here some example maps on this presentation. We looked at the historic 1943 coverage, and this is actually St. John's River Water Management District had created a land use land cover coverage for 1943 based on black and white aerials, and we just extracted the wetlands. There was no photo interpretation API done for this. It's had been done previously by the district. And so this you can see here, this is the first map of 1943 wetland extent based on that original effort. One thing to point out, it'd be great to have this extended for the rest of the watershed. That would be really useful. And hopefully one day we'll get to that. It's not part of our task. So next, click next. We'll have a couple other maps that we completed. We added both the St. John's and South Florida's latest coverage, land use land coverage, and extracted the wetlands. Uses the same exact classification method as in 1943. And here for comparison, just provide one map. And the next. We looked at other sources of classification map for comparison. This is the Florida National Areas Inventory, just extracting the same wetland types from 2017, 2018, which is the latest mapping effort done by FWC. And finally, the next map here as an example, this is the National Wetland Inventory. One thing we noticed as we were going through the mapping is, it's very important to target the year the mapping was done, especially if you're comparing all these different types of classification to maps through time. And we noticed as we dove a little deeper, if you can click on the next slide, into the National Wetland Inventory, that it really, the aerials used for the effort vary tremendously in this coverage. Between 1984 and 2015, they were all put in the same coverage. And so we decided to make some alternate maps that indicate that. And so this is what you can see here in pink on the west side. It was actually based on 1980 to 1984 aerials, and in blue, the majority of it, what you can see is actually much more 2010 to 2014. So we actually put this in ranges, but there was numerous years of imagery used for this National Wetland Inventory coverage. So we need to take this wetland mapping with a grain of salt on here. One quick point I want to point out, we are going to use the latest St. John's and South Florida's wetland maps and we have some limited funds to do some aerial photo interpretation and try to update those based on the latest imagery, which is 2019 for most counties. In a couple of them, we have 2020 imagery, actually just very, very recent imagery. And we're going to focus, with the limited funding we have, on some areas, coastal wetland areas, and update that and indicate, yes, we've looked at this. Next. On next maps that we were looking at is, like I mentioned, vacant lands. And really, I'm only showing here an example of the ones that are publicly owned. We actually have other maps that showed all the types of vacant lands by type. including, private, that would be privately owned, urban setting, etc. But here, then we extracted just the ones for other maps, just publicly owned and who the ownership was. So, city, county, state, federal, water management district, etc. Next. And in development is the conservation lands. This is really where we are right now looking at in the river lagoon trust lands. I mean, conservation lands that were already currently considered conservation, not just vacant lands that are owned by some public entity. They might even be privately owned, but conservation lands. And we are just waiting for a couple people that are going to provide this data. So far, we have had great response on any requests. If we can get it from online, most people have been great, very gracious. We appreciate that. Just on where we are on this project, the last task is really that we had was a conservation land. So that's what we are working on. And like I said, we're going to go through a limited API on the wetlands to try to update that 2014 year to at least some of the coastal wetlands with most recent 2019, 2020 imagery. And I think that's what I have for this project.
Questions about the asset mapping?
Yes. Questions?
Okay. Go ahead, Claudia.
All right, continuing on with the State of the Lagoon Technical Report. Just reminding everyone, this is really a comprehensive science-driven technical report that is to be used as a foundation of scientific knowledge for multiple objectives. What we focused on the last quarter was really trying to fine-tune the table of contents of what this report is going to be, align it as much as we can with the vital signs, and start really fine-tuning where we're going to get the data, which references we're going to get, so that we can start increasing our library, what we call it the digital library of articles. So very important here is being able to align this report to be able to update the next CCMP. That's been really the focus. So next slide. We identified the indicators, the vital sign indicators from multiple sources. We looked at the CCMP objectives, we looked at previous NEP reports, and in the River Lagoon specific literature. We started building our database of literature for that. Decided to separate the indicators for this report into 3 family of indicators: stressor indicators, condition indicators, and healthy community indicators. And I'll have the next slide will show a little bit what fall underneath each of these categories. And then the indicators were integrated and organized into a proposed table of contents. This is probably our 3rd iteration of the table of contents. As we find more data, as we look at more literature, we decide, well, this is very aligned here and that. And we got some comments that we try to address those by fine-tuning. And it's still open. I believe we're still going to be changes as actually we write different sections of this, where it makes more sense to put certain things in other locations. So next. Just a little bit more on how we try to link these indicators we're proposing to the vital signs. And part of the memorandum we just submitted to the staff last week, we created this table that is kind of a crossover table that shows the big categories of the vital signs and the vital signs themselves, like living resources, and within that we have biodiversity, species of concern. Those are all the vital signs. And then we show on the last column where they would fit in the table of contents. So 4C, 5C, that aligns with our proposed table of contents. So you will see that in many cases, you might have a vital sign that's actually touched in several locations in our proposed report. And it'll make sense once you look at the table of contents. You could have, for example, looking at HABs under certain, linked under certain water quality parameters, and also both on the human health and on the ecosystem health sections, for example. Next. So just a little bit more detail on the family of indicators. Like I said, the report will, table of contents right now is organized into these big sections. It also has background, obviously, some introductory material. But stressors would include landscape and physical, water quality, biological stressors, such as invasive species, etc., disease, climate change, condition indicators, are other types of water quality indicators underneath that, benthic, habitat, so that macroalgae, seagrass, etc., biological community, wetlands, and living shorelines. And then we include the whole section on healthy community indicators. And this is where we're looking at the connection, the integration between ecosystem and human health. Now, what are some of the indicators that directly impact human health? Next. As part of our deliverable, which was a synthesis memorandum, we not only describe an updated table of contents, how we get line, but we provided this detailed indicator matrix. So for each of those indicators we're proposing to discuss in the table of contents, we start bringing, what kind of metrics could you use? What are some other relevant signs that, from the wheel that correspond to this? What are some of the data we need? Where could we get the data? What are some of the keywords we are using for our literature focus? And already we have some of the data resources and some references associated with it. And we describe this a little bit, our logic behind looking at these metrics. Now, I want to point out that some of these metrics and parameters we know to be great to have, and likely we don't have data to do that. So this is our wish matrices, basically. And so we have one of these for each type of indicator associated with the report. Next. Okay, so this is just the timeline. And so basically, we just finished identification of vital sign indicators. We put this synthesis report together. We're going to be reaching out to the steering committee with this report in hand to try to get their feedback to make sure that now we are starting to collect the data and increase our dictionary of research and papers, that we have the correct data to be able to do this, and we'll reach out to the TAC as well to start getting specific information for some of these. And then the next, we're going to start evaluating. As we gather that, we evaluate some of the gaps. So some of these metrics, we might not have the data for it, and we want to make sure that gets quantified so we can focus some of our efforts, perhaps in the next year or so, gathering those data if that's something even possible. Next. And so this is just what comes next. Like I said, data analysis, data gathering, and build this digital library of scientific literature. We have a significant amount, but there's a lot more to be added here. And I think that's what I want to leave you with. Questions for me?
I am seeing none.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute, wait, sorry.
Wait, Chris.
Hey, Chris, I like how you raised your hand on that. That was pretty good.
Yeah,
I'm slow though. It takes me a while.
That's okay. We saw it last minute. We could have came back.
So Claudia, I have sort of a semi-unrelated question. At Stetson, we're working on a project where we're working with the Central Florida Planning Council on prioritizing conservation lands based on threats from sea level rise and changes over the long term. So we're trying to link prioritization now with long-term stressors and changing priorities, right, based on future changes. So what I'm wondering is, it sounds like what you're doing could be a really important component of that, or related directly to what we're doing. So my question is sort of, when is this going to be done, and how can we include you in that process?
I'm actually going to be reaching out to you very soon as part of the pack. So that's a great connection. So, this whole, the whole report is going to take, this is a multi-year effort. I would love to share, we're going to be building on this. So I think the next year is where we are really going to focus on starting to complete some of the stressor sections of the report, but we are going to actually be building these into independent, they're almost like different chapters that have their own references, and they might even have multiple authors, not just be us leading the whole. And that's what I'm going to be looking for, the TAC. And so you're actually on my list to contact. And so I'll be reaching out to you, and I'd love to. That's exactly what we want to do. We want this to be a useful management tool. So this is supposed to synthesize the data, gather the data that allows other people to do prioritization efforts. So it's a great question. I think the whole report, you know, in graphical, pure beauty format, as is a 4-year really plan. I'm not sure. I have like virus scan starting here. This is good timing. So yeah, I'm not sure that we need to wait that long. I mean, I want people to help build it. Right?
We're gonna actually have a postdoc who's gonna be working on kind of putting together a lot of this information and.
Right. I love postdocs. I'm trying to get people to help me collect some of these references. We have hundreds, and so just building this digital library, we want to get universities and postdocs involved in this, and the experts to help us even think of, are we missing any metrics? Should we synthesize the data in a different way? So I'll definitely reach out to you. We're reaching out next week, actually, to the top members.
And let me just say to everybody, if you know any postdoc that's, you know, that is interested in this area, this sort of spatial analysis and conservation planning, we actually have a position that we're advertising for a 2-year postdoc at Stetson. So you might want to just spread the word.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Chuck, before you move on, I wanted to jump in and just let everybody know that we're expecting Balmoral and Randy Parkinson to deliver their final product on the Climate Ready Estuary Adaptation Plan, which also has a lot of, you know, good information, to bring to the table as we begin to consolidate this and ask the kind of the big so what question. So as soon as that's available for distribution, we'll get it out to everybody.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? Going once, going twice, going 3 times.
I see no one.
Thank you. Lisa.
Lisa.
Hey everyone, this is Lisa Soto with MRC. I'm happy to see you all. I can't wait till we can actually be in the same room together again. I'm going to be talking about the Boater's Guide that MRC and FWRI are working together on. So you can go ahead and start. So you'll recall that we were tasked with updating the Boater's Guide. FWRI has an extensive history and a data set of existing data that really our team is updating. Also want to recognize the Florida Inland Navigational District, not only for providing cash match to this effort, but also for Janet Zimmerman's really yeoman effort in collecting data down in Martin and St. Lucie counties. Next slide, please. What we focused on this year was this quarter, well, I guess it was this year, 2020 was data collection. And we used an existing FWRI database and for the fishing piers, we were just updating existing data, confirming whether those fishing piers were still there. Some of those data were from the 90s. We've had multiple hurricanes since then, so some of the piers were just gone, making sure that the data were accurate, those piers were present, and any new piers were entered. And then the other facility that we were collecting information on was marinas and restaurants where you could pull up on your boat. Next slide. FWRI created a survey tool that you could collect data through your smartphone. We did 7 online trainings involving 27 of our steering committee members in those training sessions. And these are the instruction guides that go with that. You see those QR codes. You know, Chris Anderson at FWRI made it super easy to download the surveys to your phone just by taking a photo or hovering your camera really over the QR code. The survey would then populate onto your phone into the downloaded Survey 123 for ArcGIS app. This is an incredible tool for collecting georeferenced data kind of on the fly. So there's one for fishing piers, one for each county, and then the marina restaurant survey, there was just one survey, and these are new data that are being collected with a georeference point. Next slide. Along with this tool, this is what it looks like. So when you open the ArcGIS Survey 123 app, it'll pull up what this first screen it looks like on the left with all the different counties, and then you click on your county, for example, Volusia, and then it'll come up with a list of the fishing piers, and you select your fishing pier and you start entering your information. Very, very simple. Next slide. Along with that set of tools, they also created a ArcGIS map where you could see what's been done and what hasn't been done. So the dots on this map are the fishing piers in Volusia County. The squares are going to be the marinas and restaurants. And then if you hover or you click on a dot, you can see if the survey has been completed, if all the data are entered, who did the survey, and so on. And this is what MRC team has been using to advise our steering committee where they need to go. So this is how we know who's doing what still needs to be done. Anybody can access that through that link, that tinyurl.com link right there, using that login and password. You can go out there and see what everybody's up to. Next slide. And this is the status over the next couple slides. This is the fishing pier surveyed by county as of April the 29th. You can see that the Indian River, St. Lucie counties, all of them have been completed. In Martin, we have 4 left. In Brevard, we have 10 left. And some of those are on military property that we need to get access to. And up in Volusia, there are 19 fishing piers left to be surveyed. Next slide. Marinas. So these are the number of marinas that have been entered as of that date, April 29. In Volusia, there were 5, in Brevard, 13, and so on. I think the point here is if your marina is not in our map, then it's not going to show up in this boater's guide. So, you know, we need, if you want your county to be well represented in a, you know, in an online tourism and in a print version tourism piece, we need to get as much information as we can on the marinas that are out there and what they're doing. Next slide. And the restaurants. So these are the boater available restaurants. You know, if you have a boat, they either have a dock or they have access where you can arrive by dock. And this is the number of restaurants that have been identified and surveyed by county. Next slide. So we need to get these all wrapped up. We were hoping to get them done by mid-April. We know we're a little behind. We've given our steering committee another 2 weeks. We feel confident we can get them done. And then we're going to start writing content for the Boater's Guide, focusing really on boating safety, clean boating practices, the Clean Marina program, and then pointing people to resources where they can get additional information on what's available in their county. Next slide. I think that's it, actually. Are there any questions?
Questions for Lisa?
Yeah, we got the easy one.
All right.
I'm saying
Chuck,
that one.
before you go on, I want to wrap a pretty ribbon around these 4 last presentations for everybody. For those of you who were here, you know, 30 years ago, you remember we had the characterization reports. These 4 documents, along with some you're going to see that staff are doing, are going to really represent a new baselining, you know, for this program. You know, each one supports the CCMP. Some are mandates by EPA, and some, as Claudia mentioned, and actually so did Dennis. There's going to be some areas of gaps that simply aren't going to be addressed in the next year or 2. You know, and Chris mentioned about, you know, allocations of funds. So kind of think of this as the beginning, kind of it's the next phase of CCMP implementation. We're driving a little deeper into the weeds on the details, kind of advising where we are 5 years and 10 years out. But I wanted to, number 1, finalize this section today by thanking you all. If you've been helping these contractors get information, we deeply, deeply appreciate it. And those who haven't been called yet, to urge you to respond fully, you know, quickly. They've got a lot on their plates and they need your individual and collective expertise and, you know, and experience. And so as they call for help, we look forward to having you all weigh in at every level that you can to make these successful and really complete documents. So thank you all. And thanks to the contractors. They've been working hard. That's it, Chuck.
Yep. Well, you're up again.
Okay, so we've got about 9 business items. Some of are kind of a continuation of conversations we had. And item 8A is one of those. If you'll remember, pursuant to our RFP discussion in our last meeting, there was a recommendation that the management conference, so both your committee as well as the management board, wanted staff to find additional dollars for the one project that was on the fence with partial funding, and that was the Sewell's Point Stormwater Project. In our audit review, current budget updates, we have found those additional dollars, and just to be, clear and consistent with, full due diligence and transparency, we just wanted to bring this requested action back to you. And really it is simply, we're going to include the Sewell's Point, within our 2021 business plan as a fully funded project, and recommend that staff negotiate and enter into contracts pursuant to authority and availability of funds. Pretty simple. Chuck?
Yeah, thank you. So do we have a motion?
Mr. Badisco, I move.
Thank you, Chris. And a second.
Lisa Krimsky, I second.
Thank you, Lisa. Any discussion? Anyone opposed? I think we're good to go. Dan?
All right, so we have a couple of budget resolutions. This first one, 2020-02, reconciles our annual audit that was completed. Next slide, Keeling. This is kind of the notes and the detail of that budget amendment. Before audit had been completed, I had come up with some projects in the last budget amendment that were identified, and they were listed under revenue. That amount is now accounted for in the fund balance from audit. So that's why that was reduced there under revenue. The audit increase is in the detail, shows all the projects that are moving forward into this fiscal year that still have money left. And there is really no other changes to any other line items such as salary and benefits, facility, administrative costs, administrative services. So we're just reconciling the audit, and at the end of the year, with all expenditures, including reserve, we had $5,627, and you'll see that roll forward into 2021.
Any questions for Dan before we move on? Okay, so I think we're looking for a motion to recommend to the IRL Council Board of Directors that they adopt this resolution. Do I have someone who is willing to do that?
I think Bob Day's trying to do that, but we can't hear him. Bob, would you like to confirm you're trying to make a motion? Shake your head.
Bob.
Do a thumbs up.
Do a thumbs up. We can't hear you at all. Are you trying to make a motion?
This is Ann. I'll so move.
Okay. So that was Amber. And a second, please.
Kevin Johnson, second.
Okay. Anybody have any discussion regarding this? Anybody opposed? Perfect. Okay, Dan.
All right, next couple slides, Kayleen. All right, so back in February, we went through our tentative budget, and pursuant to Florida statutes, we have to pass a final budget in May. So this resolution 2020-03 is for our final budget. What I did here is brought that, next slide, Kayleen. What I did was I brought forward that $5,627 from the last budget and identified two projects that were either under budget, you can see in item number 3 there in the notes, and one project that was withdrawn. So West Wabasso septic to sewer was supposed to be $200,000. They came in under budget, so they only requested $132 roughly from us. And the city of Fellsmere withdrew their project because they just couldn't provide match for that project. So with those two projects, we were able to fully fund Sewell's Point, that additional $93,973. and the remaining 29,000 is going to go into our unplanned contingency reserve, which brings that up to $88,876. And there's no other changes on any other line items from the tentative budget you saw back in February.
Any questions for Dan? So here we're looking for a motion to recommend that the IRL Council Board of Directors adopt this resolution. Someone willing to make the motion?
Mitch Roth is willing to move that we accept this.
Second?
Christie Vidisco, I second.
Anybody have any comments on this? Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. Kayleen.
Getting there. Okay. So we're bringing back to you the conclusion or the results of the 2020 Small Grant Program proposals that were scored last Thursday by the entire CAC. We had a total of 37 proposals with a total requested amount of $138,173,000. What you're seeing on the screen now are the top 7 that were ranked for inclusion of funding. Before you vote on this, I want to remind you, if you are with an entity that may be a conflict of interest on any of these, please recuse yourself from voting. And for the record, you might want to state it for us, please. And that's what I have for this.
Questions for Kayleen? Anybody who feels they need to recuse themselves? Okay, can we have a motion? We need 2 motions for this one. First is to accept these recommendations and approve the final ranked list. Can I tempt someone to make that motion?
Mitch Roth, so moved.
Thank you. And a second?
Lisa Krimsky, second.
Go, Lisa. Thank you. Any further discussion of this matter? Anyone opposed? Perfect. Okay, the second thing we want to do is recommend that the Board of Directors accept the overall management conference recommendations and fund these top proposals consistent with the availability of funds, etc., and to authorize the staff to negotiate these contracts. Is there someone who would move that we do that?
Mitch Roth will move again that we do it.
Is everybody awake out there?
I'll second. Rich Paperno, I'll second.
Okay, Rich.
I got you, Bob. I'll get you in the next one. Okay, any discussion? Anyone opposed? Great. Back to Dwayne.
Nope.
Nope.
Kathy.
Oh, what happened?
Yep, this goes on to Kathy now for the fine. Wait, Kathy, you're still muted. There you go.
I think I'm good now. So CAC has also decided, beyond making their recommendations, they are going to revisit the proposal criteria during their July meetings, just to make sure that what we're getting for small grants is hitting the intention for the program. So small grants were intended initially for small nonprofits, community groups like Boy Scouts, or school groups, or teachers, to do little projects. So these go from $500 to $5,000. And we noticed, and the CAC noticed, took serious note of, if you look through the list of what is getting funded, there are sort of larger nonprofits, and you know, we have universities applying, and so they I think want to revisit the proposal criteria to make sure the intent for those funds is hitting where it's intended. So they'll be looking at those criteria again in July.
Any questions for Kathy before we move on? Perfect. All right. Now back to Dwayne.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I'm going to do this one relatively quickly. In your package, you'll have information about the 2022 RFP. This motion kind of recommends that we start to move forward with that process. And I just want to caveat everything is that COVID-19 may change where we stand on this. And so we wanted to get this moving early. So we've got August to contemplate any changes that may have to occur. Also in your documentation, we heard you loud and clear in the STEM AC as it related to normalizing scores. So we had a sheet with proposed changes to process. We can fine tune that as we go. But could I have the next slide, Kayleen? What I wanted from you today is some guidance. And so previous year priorities have focused water quality, habitat restoration, citizen engagement in restoration, and science and innovation. And all of these prioritized around nutrient pollution reduction, ecosystem health, harmful algal blooms, and human health. And there has been some discussion, and it's a philosophical discussion about, maybe is it time to just have a very narrow RFP call in science and innovation, or is it good to be broad? And so we had this discussion at the meeting this morning with the management board, and they felt that, this has been working well. One of the recommendations is to maybe provide a little bit of extra examples of priority kinds of projects, but allow the review committees and your advisory committee, so in the STEM AC, allow you to have a little broader call on the front end, because you can decide through the process how you want to prioritize and what you want to prioritize based on your ranking. So my first question to you is going to be, do we kind of move forward with the same, general set of categories, or do you want to change it up? Do you want to recommend a change up? And the last is a staff recommendation. We had an economic study done in 2016, got 25,000 in the budget, thinking that we might be able to lure some partners to the table to move that forward. We did not have that success. And so the thought was, maybe it's important to actually do an RFP call to update the 2016 economic study, and then to expand that study that was initiated by the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council to also include, consideration of ecosystem services, as well as consideration of the negative impacts of COVID-19. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I have. We're looking for a general recommendation. See how you all feel about moving forward, if you have consensus. And then we'll be revisiting this again in August, no matter what happens. That'll give us way more than enough time to do what we need to do to get these RFPs out on the street early in the fall and increase the amount of time for people to respond. So with that, I'll just throw it to you, Chuck.
Thank you, Mitch. I take it that's your hand up.
Yep. What's the advantage versus the disadvantage of going all innovative grants versus the standard way of doing it? Are we far enough along with the science that we're ready to make this shift? Question.
I think it's a great question, and I'll just give you my personal opinion on this one, Mitch. I kind of like the idea that our community gets to respond kind of more broadly into science and innovation right now, because in a way, some of the immediate needs, like this management plan, we've done it outside of kind of this broader call. I think as we get through COVID next year in 22, then I think we're going to start to move ourselves to some very specific questions. And I'll give you an example of one that might be a question for down the line, and that is, should we have an RFP to specifically look at, ecosystem drivers of, brown tide blooms, Oreo umbra, both in the lab and in the field. And you saw how difficult that was with Ed. As soon as he gets funding from NSF, the blooms stop. So I'm very comfortable from the staff side to say, we are getting really good projects. I think fine-tuning our ranking every year is a good thing, but I'm not recommending as your executive director that we should shift gears yet. But it's my personal opinion.
I'm concerned, as I always have, as we start getting into an organization that we're now getting some funding, that we study the problem to death and we don't have any innovative remediation to fix the problem. I think there's a substantial amount of knowledge that we have in this committee, as well as around the lagoon, that perhaps we need to really step forward and push the remediation now. But with COVID and the economy going slow, let's say, for the next 3 to 5 years, I'm concerned about the money for the Save the Lagoon program, the amount of sales tax going to go forward. And I don't want to see after 10 years that we've done certain things, but we're sort of waited. Why did you wait so long to do this? If you knew the technology existed to remove the nitrogen out of the water, et cetera, quickly on an industrial level, why did you wait? And that's my concern.
Yeah, and I can address that directly, having been in that industry. As much as I would love to have the kind of financial resources to fund those kinds of projects, those kinds of pilot studies with true technological advancement at kind of commercial scale, we just don't have that. We don't have a budget to be able to support that. So we'll be looking to our partners at both state and federal levels, to drive some of those bigger projects. But I agree with you. We need to keep those opportunities available with our limited budget. Remember last year, Dan, remind me if I get this wrong, I think we had $100,000 for science and innovation. And in the world of remediation, 100,000 doesn't go very far.
Chris?
Just one more comment. I think if we would have had our Marine Technology Society workshop, which we were planning on having, a lot of these ideas for what could be done in terms of innovative remediation would have come out. So maybe when we have that, there will be no need for a separate RFP for innovative remediation, and we should stay the course.
And those of you who aren't aware of that, where we are on that, my plan is that we will be funding next year. If it's not with, if Marine Technology Society decides not to move forward with the tech surge, I'm already working with our economic development folks to do it on our own. So Mitch, we will be having, as long as we've got funding, we will be having some sort of a technology industry-based workshop in 2021, either with Marine Technology Society or even possibly with a much larger cohort of partners.
Thank you.
Can I jump in really quick, Chuck? I just want to let everybody know we're getting dangerously close to not having a quorum.
Yes.
And we have 4 items on the agenda that need some action.
Yes. I fully appreciate that. And I was going to ask for.
So nobody leave.
Yeah, please nobody leave.
Chris, do you have something you want to add quickly?
Sure, I can circle back to this after we finish business if you want to just talk about this when we do our final roundup. We'll just circle back here.
So I guess, the key to that was give it some thought, take a look at what's in your packet, and get back to us if you have things that you'd like to see talked about, because we'll come back to this in August.
We actually need a motion, Chuck.
Yep. So we're looking for a motion here to authorize staff to develop and issue the RFPs on or before the 1st of November 2020. Someone willing to
So moved.
Mitch, Bob, you want your chance?
Go ahead, Richard, I'll yield.
Wait at me, Bob. We need a second. Thank you,
There
Bob.
we go.
Yeah, way to go, Bob. Okay, anything anybody else wants to add? Anyone opposed? All right. Coastal Resilience Partnerships. Dr. DeFries.
Okay, I've got 2 requested actions on this. Both are partnerships, both are through resolution. The first is that I've been participating and now am a board member of the Southeast and Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership, originally and up to now funded through NOAA and Socorro. That partnership is expanding both its capacity and base. And so first motion is requested to formally, recognize our partnership with SCDRP. And the second motion is more on a local regional level. The East Central Florida Regional Resilience Collaborative has been bringing together the Regional Planning Council of East Central Florida, as well as the cities. They reached out because of our work in Climate Ready Estuary, felt like we would be a really good kind of national regional partner at the table with them. And so the request is recommendation from you to the board to formally join by resolution these 2 regional associations.
This is Ann, so moved.
Thank you, Ann. So that's for the first one. This is a motion to recommend that we join the Southeast and Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership. Second?
I have a second from Megan Stolen.
Oh, that's good enough. That'll do. And anyone opposed? All right. So the second motion is to recommend to the Board of Directors that join the East Central Florida Regional Resilience Collaborative.
So moved. This is Ann.
Thank you, Ann. Second?
Second, Rich Paperno.
Anyone opposed? All right. Interns.
All right, I'm kind of excited about this one, and I'm hoping you all are too. COVID-19 hit, we are a independent agency of the state of Florida, and staff and I were thinking about, so how can we do something more active, either support response or recovery? In our budget process back in 2018, we had some direction from board to go ahead and fund some internships during the summer. We actually did one, but we had money kind of set aside that's been in our reserve cash budget. So this request would be to do some bridge funding. So we're proposing 10 summer professional internships. This would be competitively let through a call. If you all in council support it next Friday, that would happen quite quickly. Each one of those 10, it would be $2,000 internships for the summer with very specific scope of work deliverables for each, with the idea that this would only be available to public sector, private sector, or independent sector folks working on the Indian River Lagoon that were either put out of work, furloughed, or could document the fact that they were no longer working because of COVID-19. So if somebody had been furloughed from one of our NGOs or the university, or funding was lost because of COVID, each individual could apply for up to 3 of these, but only 1 would be awarded per awardee. So we would have 10 interns, 10 scopes of work, 10 deliverables. They would contract with us directly as individuals, not as agencies. They would be contractors, not employees. At midterm on the contract, they would give us, 50% deliverable, and we pay $1,000. And at the end, they'd have to complete their commitment to get the remaining $1,000. But we thought this was a way that we could help, some of our community friends who are out there in undeterminate levels of furlough, and really get some experienced and good people working on a couple of quick projects with clear deliverables. But I'll just open for questions with that, Chuck.
Oh, Chuck, wait, you're muted.
Dwayne, the documentation does say you can apply for 2, not 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess we backed it off. So we said 2. We had 3 originally. I guess we changed to 2.
Valerie?
Yeah, just a quick question. Are you, I think it's a great idea, Dwayne. Are you proposing that these be predefined to work with the council on specific projects, or are you asking the interns to come up with
These
them?
are predefined, Val. They're in your package.
Right, okay, got it.
And so they're very specific deliverables to things that we thought we could immediately apply to either a high value use or a project that's already moving forward that could use additional data. A lot of it, it's data synthesis, and getting some background or backline data on board.
Lisa?
Hey, I just wondered if these private sector furloughed people are eligible for like $800 a week in unemployment at this point. Would this impact their unemployment eligibility, or do you know?
As a contract, I do not think so, but that's their responsibility to make sure that they don't, violate, their unemployment, because it's not this is not an employment agreement. This is a task contract agreement. I think it's viewed quite differently, but, we could put a little language, that they need to make sure that, should they apply, that they're not putting themselves at risk. But that's their responsibility, not ours.
Chris, you still got your hand up? There you go.
Sorry. So I think it's a smart idea, and I think it's the kind of thing that people need. Institutions that have the funding need to be stepping up to do this, because I think there's going to be a lot of people that are hurting, and this is a good chance to get some quality help for us, and B, to kind of patch people through. So I think it's pretty innovative and smart.
Anyone else? And folks, if you have something on, can you mute whatever you're working through? There's some background noise that is bothering something.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that's coming from because everybody's muted. So except
yeah, Wendy. I think Wendy's the one that isn't. So
yeah,
you might be on the phone. Any other questions at this point? If not, then can we have a motion to recommend to the board of directors that they approve and fund 10 such internships dependent on funds and so forth?
I move. Chris Davidisco, I move.
This is Ann, I second.
Okay. Any discussion? Anyone opposed? All right, then. Mr. Executive Director.
Aileen, I'm going to go through this quite quickly, and I'll start in the bottom pack. You can see that we've been busy the last quarter. So we've already submitted in just the last 90 days our mid-year progress report to EPA. Also, Dan did a yeoman's job with staff. We are the first to put in our work plan, for 21. And so we're being reviewed, for that 21 work plan that still needs to be certified by EPA. EPA is going through a lot of internal strife right now about kind of how do you look at an NEP, and so I turned around a quick white paper. They said if we were to start to look at you all, based on nutrient reduction, what might that look like? What are some of the challenges? So I sent a white paper draft, just to start that conversation. I served on a subcommittee. We're having a discussion about this tomorrow because it's not applicable in all places. And, is it appropriate, for example, to use data give you a good example on oyster denitrification from New England and apply that denitrification rate at a national level just because EPA doesn't have any other data. So we're having a pretty good science discussion. Kathy's working on the NEP communications plan. We hope to have that for your kind of a review in August. I'm working on a strategies for financing the CCMP. And the on the ground question is, if you need $4 billion, to do this, where do you find that kind of money? That's going to go through a very iterative process, starting with the finance subcommittee of the management board. That has already been drafted, probably going to go out next week to that finance subcommittee. You will see that draft for comment in August. And then I have resurrected the Science 2030 discussion that you all had with Chuck and I back, thinking it was 2018, Chuck. And what I'm going to do with that is just send it to you all individually in some draft format so you can get a real hard look at it between now and August. And then we'll bring that one back for discussion. And this is really about the big questions. What are the big question drivers of science? Kayleen's been looking to cross-reference BMAP projects and reasonable assurance plan projects with our project list. Turns out that's not an easy task. And so in her spare time, she's taken that one on. At the end of this month, the onelagoon.org website will be the only website. So, from now until the end of the month, our old website is active. May 30th, if you go on council.com, you will be immediately directed to onelagoon.org. And this transition is not only to have a new website and a new look, but also to be fully ADA accessible. And we are that. And Tayleen's done incredible work. And then Kathy and I are participating in Mobile Bay's 5-year evaluation. COVID's changed everything. And I don't want to end this meeting on a downer, but we have really a lot of uncertainty about funding for next year. So we're moving forward business as usual, but we're not going to execute any contracts that would start October 1 for at least another 3 or 4 weeks, or until we have some assurances from our funding agencies that we're not going to see funding pulled back for next year, so our 2021 fiscal year. The Florida legislative budget has not been sent to the governor. There may be a special session. It may be that the governor, pulls that budget back through his veto power. So we have questions about where we stand financially at the state level and with our partners in the interlocal.
I think Dwayne froze. Everybody else froze?